Greetings all. This is Dr. Berkeley, and this is the first competency module for strategic thinking for the course Management for 30 Human Resource Management. In this module, or this competency, we're going to address strategic thinking, specifically what does it mean to do HR strategy and why it's important for HR professionals to know everything that they can about strategy. And we're also going to do a nice overview on human resource management, what it is, why it's important to the organization, and what role human resource professionals play in the big picture. So each module, each lecture will be in 15-minute increments. So if you have any questions, let me know. So what is human resource management? And its name kind of tells you everything you need to know. It's how do we manage the human resources that we use to do the work of the business every single day. So human resource management is about the decisions that we make regarding the people who work in the company. We want to be effective in what we do, so we want to be able to effectively use our human capital, or the human beings that are working in our organization. So that is also incredibly important. So every decision we make regarding how we're going to pay people, or what kind of evaluation tool we're going to use, or who we're going to hire, who we're going to fire, all of these are decisions about people, and we do this to be as effective as the organization is able to be given our resources and constraints. Now, when we talk about the life cycle of the employee, this means from beginning to end. So what people don't always realize is the relationship with a job applicant or an employee actually starts when you write your job recruitment ad and you put it in whatever source you are using to communicate with your employees or future employees. For example, you might load something on Indeed, or you might put it in the newspaper, or you might have a listing at the Society for Human Resource Management Professional Organization, whatever. You might do college recruiting. Whatever it is you do for that first initial message with potential applicants, that is the beginning of a life cycle of our employee. So we need to know, even before that, how many employees are we going to need? How many do we need to hire? Are we always hiring on an ongoing basis, kind of like McDonald's is? They always have an application that they hand out to people, and usually somebody leaves at least a couple times a week, and they hire people to replace them fairly quickly. And that's not uncommon. And so we need the planning side of things has to happen. And then we send that recruitment message out, and that recruitment message gets to people, and it starts to signal to people who we are as a company and what we value and what's important. From there, we get them into the pool. We need to get them to actually apply to the company for a job. We then need to screen that pool, decide who is minimally qualified, and then from there continue to do the work that we need to do to assess the employee, to find the best person who is going to do the best job. And we call that person-job match. And you'll hear me talk about that, in the section when we talk about talent acquisition. So we want to make sure that we have a pool of people who are diverse, because in diversity we have better performance of an organization. There is long-standing evidence that diversity is much better for organizations and for biological entities in general when we have diversity. Homogeneity doesn't benefit any organization, and we have long history of looking at organizations that have struggled with having homogeneity and not being able to compete in the business world. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the module on employee relations. We want to make sure, though, that we are complying with all local, state, and national laws. We want to talk about recruitment, selection. Recruitment is getting the people here. Selection is hiring them. Training and development is making sure that they have the skills to do their job today and into the future. Performance management is how do we make sure everybody's operating at peak performance, being as effective as they can be, going back to that second bullet point there on organizational effectiveness. We want to be able to reward people for good performance, and we want to be able to differentiate between good performers and poor performers. It doesn't do the organization any good to treat everybody the same because they're not the same. So it is really important that we focus on making sure that we understand what it is we're looking for in terms of behaviors, and then absolutely rewarding that when we see it. We also want to make sure our workers are safe and that they have all the resources they need to be able to do their job. And if we need to separate from them for any reason, whether they leave on their own because of turnover or retirement, or we choose to fire somebody for lack of performance, or to make sure that we are getting rid of people because of layoffs, right? Because layoffs are a big thing, and they're going to happen cyclically in organizations. We hire and then we lay off. It's a fairly common phenomenon, sadly, but it is one that we can expect. And all of these are what we call the life cycle of the employee, from the moment they learn about our organization, and even before that, as we plan for who we need, all the way to when they leave the company. Lastly, we want to talk about the organizational goals, because using our human resources just to do work, if it's not helping the company achieve its goals, is useless. So this is where the strategic thinking comes into play, right? We want to make sure our employees not only know how to do their jobs and have all the resources they need to do that, but they also need to be able to do this in alignment with the strategy of the organization. And you'll see in this module in a little bit, as you listen to this in order, what it means to do strategic alignment, and how do we make sure that our employees are doing the work that is needed based on the strategic objectives of the company. So this is a really important part of that. So human resource management decision making is like any other kind of decision making. We are prone to bias. And bias means simply that we do something that takes us away from the behaviors that we should be engaged in. We should be looking at our applicants in an objective manner and assessing them objectively based on what they can do. Often, though, our own biases, unconscious as well as conscious biases, can have an impact on the kinds of decisions that we make in human resource management. There's things like availability bias, or anchoring bias, or overconfidence bias. And availability bias means I'm making a decision based on the information in front of me rather than actually doing the research to make sure I know the full scope of things. So an example of this might be there is an airplane crash in the news, right? And we then decide airplane travel is unsafe and I'm only going to drive. But if you actually did research and learned that the probability of getting into an airplane accident versus the probability of getting into a car accident and dying from either one of them, the probability of dying from a car accident is way higher than the probability of dying in an airplane crash, because airplane crashes are rare, and they don't happen very often. In fact, almost next to nothing, to be honest. So anchoring is where I come in and I go, hey, I have this idea, something that I want you to do. Here's what I think the solution is. What do you think? It's unlikely that any employee is going to come up with an idea different than what the CEO or the boss came in and said, this is what I think the solution is. Because when you anchor somebody to a solution, they're not really able to think differently from the information that was presented to them. That anchoring is the thing that makes it really challenging for somebody to be as creative as we need. And what we know about 21st century decision making is we need to be creative. We need to have creative solutions. And when we are our options are narrowed by somebody coming in and saying, well, I only want you to think about it this way, this is a problem. Overconfidence is simply that. We tend to, confirmation bias or overconfidence bias is where we tend to only gather information that confirms our ideas rather than looking for disconfirming evidence. And we know the best decision making that is done in organizations are those people who not only look for evidence that confirms their point of view, but they actively go after information that disproves it. Because again, we want to have as much confidence as possible that what we're doing is the right thing. So we need to make sure that we look for things that support us, but also look for things that might tell us we may not be 100% correct. And then we need to investigate under what conditions might our ideas not work, that we would not have an accurate assessment of things. These are just a handful of different kinds of biases. There is a ton more. I know that you've taken Management 330 or some equivalent of it in your Principles of Management class. And this information really helps you to understand how people make decisions. And people make decisions, and we make biased decisions all the time. And our goal is to be aware of that and to work really hard to mitigate that, to make sure that we don't continue to do the biased behaviors. So we have to be open for feedback, we have to be open to correction, and we have to be open to changing our mind when we see something that basically shows us that we were wrong. So, as we talked about decision making and action, let's take it the next step. And how do you know that you're making a good decision? And obviously, research shows about 50% of our decisions are successful. We're always going to make mistakes. We just can't be afraid to make mistakes. Sometimes we're going to make a mistake and we just have to fix it. But in areas where we know better and we should do better. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is ethical, legal, and fair. So if we make sure that we're not violating any laws, we're being fair to people based on how people perceive things to be fair, meted out, proportionately or fairly or equally to people, and are we doing things ethically? And ethics in human resource management is important. As human resource professionals, we adhere to ethical guidelines, and so we want to make sure that we are on top of that and making sure we are making good ethical decisions. So how do we figure things out? Ask questions. Dig in. Do the research. Go look at not only evidence that confirms that we are right, but evidence that might give us some indications why we might be wrong. So look for the disconfirming evidence, because the more that we have evidence what we're doing is right, particularly looking at the disconfirming evidence, if it exists, then that increases our successful decision-making rates. And so we want to make sure that our organization is healthier, in a better place, that we're using our people and our money and our resources in a very efficient and effective manner. Actually, I start with effective first. It's got to be effective, and then we can move towards efficiency. Once we know that we are making effective decisions, then we can streamline to do things better. And then we always need to be taking into account stakeholders. And stakeholders for human resource management is pretty much, everybody in the organization. What we do is certainly impacted by the organization and the people in it. But our goal ultimately is ask good questions. Do your research. Do your homework. Dig in, know what the research tells you, that if you do X, Y is going to happen. If you do P, then Q is going to happen. If you do A, then B is going to happen. And apply this to the organization and be an advocate for your employees. So how do we know we're making good decisions? You'll know once you do your evaluation of your decisions. And we'll talk about evaluation, of course, in a little bit in this lecture, but it's always important to close the loop, making a decision and then evaluating whether or not we were effective in doing that. Was it a good decision? Debrief, go back in, and then learn from your failures. Your greatest successes will come from learning from failures. As weird as that sounds, it's true. when we learn from, but we don't learn much from successes. When we assume because we were successful, everything was fine, sometimes we were successful in spite of ourselves. Like I know somebody who thought they were a really good bar owner, and they were successful because they had a niche group that they were working with, but this person made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and despite those bad decisions, were still successful. And then eventually they were no longer successful because there's only so many times you can make bad decisions and have it work for you. Eventually it will fall apart, and eventually it'll collapse. And so the first bit of evidence that this person was making bad decisions and it was going to start to hurt them was when they lost their Budweiser contract as a bar in St. Louis. And that's kind of weird, right? That a bar in St. Louis will not be able to sell Budweiser because they have a bad relationship with Bud and they weren't paying their bills. And then ultimately the person had to sell the bar, and it no longer exists, which is really sad. So always make sure you are evaluating your decisions, making sure you've made good decisions, and then ultimately learn from mistakes and reevaluate every single time you make a decision.